So at the end of my 6th grade year, Michelle Komodo and Chrissy Brady and Laurie Johnston, they all told me that I was going to get invited to an end of the school year party. And this is a big deal because we've been in grade school since the 1st grade together. We had tight relationships, and they were the most popular girls in school. And so I waited every day at the mailbox for my invitation to arrive. That was almost 50 years ago. And I'm still waiting. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So what are you waiting for? Have you noticed how hard it is to wait? Waiting requires a level of patience that very few of us have. And when we wait, there is anxiety and stress and worry and wonder, and waiting can take a lot of work. And I don't wait so well. So whether it's waiting for an invitation to come in the mail, or waiting for Christmas, or waiting for a phone call from someone to tell me that they're safe, or waiting for a test exam, or waiting for a doctor to give a diagnosis, we find waiting to be exceedingly difficult. What are you waiting for? So we hear another parable of Jesus as we go through this summer of telling the stories from the New Testament. And have you noticed how many of Jesus' parables have to do with waiting? It might be a parable talking about waiting for a crop to come up. Or maybe it's a parable of a father waiting for his son to come home. Or maybe a parable of a landowner who has gone away and they're waiting for him to return. Waiting is a major theme in the stories that Jesus tells. And then we get to this parable today. And there are 10 women. They're called, well, bridesmaids in some translations, maidens in other translations. In the Greek, they're virgins. And they're waiting for the bridegroom to show up. And so anticipating it's going to be a long wait, they bring their lamps. Because maybe he's not going to get there until the evening. But then they discover he doesn't come even then. It's going to be even later than that. And 5 of them were wise enough, evidently, to be able to have extra flasks of oil. But 5 did not. In the English translation that you have in the Bibles, those 5 are called foolish. In the Greek, the original language in which the New Testament was written, they're called morons. Isn't that great? So as we heard, the groom is delayed, and when he finally shows up, the morons had to go buy some more oil because the bridesmaids who had extra oil wouldn't share. And so the groom comes, the wise are invited into the party, and the others are left outside. Now, I've done a lot of sermons, or a lot of weddings in my life. I have yet to experience a wedding quite like this, where the bridesmaids have to wait for the groom. What's going on there? Why do they have to wait? And why is he late? And where is he coming from? It's kind of an odd story when you start peeling it away. And people have been telling this story, this parable, for years. I can remember as a kid hearing this parable, and quite frankly, being a little uneasy about it. It's a troubling parable, as the message seems to be that we need to be ready for Jesus, the Messianic bridegroom, because someday he's coming back. And most certainly there are plentiful passages in the New Testament which speak to this message of Jesus returning someday. And so, you better be ready. You better need to do whatever you have to do so that you're not caught off guard and found asleep. Well, that promise was made 2,000 years ago, and we're still waiting. How often do you think about the return of Jesus? I frankly don't think a lot about it, and I don't know a lot of people who do. Oh, every once in a while, somebody writes a book or some television show spoke about a particular time that Jesus is expected to show up, but we've been down that road enough times to know that none of those predictions have come true. And so when we hear stories about Jesus returning, we're kind of less than excited about them. But it doesn't stop many from trying to get that message through. I mean, just last week, somebody dropped a flyer off at my house that asked the question, when Jesus returned, do you know what will happen to you? There are groups that have huge focus on this. And this parable might get spoken in order to amp up the emotional awaiting of what it means to anticipate the return of Jesus. You've got to be either awake or asleep. Are you going to be wise or foolish? Are you going to be smart or moronic? No. You want to stay awake, don't you? But I have problems with this parable. It's not an easy parable to read. It certainly sounds like we have to do something in order to get invited into the party. And as a Lutheran that relies heavily upon the grace of God and the belief that faith is the key indicator of our relationship with God, anything that smacks of having to do something, of works righteousness, just doesn't feel good to me. And then there's the matter of the wise women. I don't wish to spend eternity with people who are so selfish that they refuse to help those who have less than themselves. There's almost an air of smug satisfaction in these women who go off to the party. Any first grader can tell you they're not nice people. Don't they care about the people left behind? Don't they care about those who are outside, their friends, their sisters? And then there's this part about the bridegroom. Why is he late? And why is it that when he shows up, there's no explanation, no apology? In fact, what troubles me the most is the level of uncomfortable lack of mercy that he seems to have for those who are left outside. I'm sorry, I never knew you, he said. Really? Is that what we're supposed to think of Jesus, of God? At stake here for me is the character of God. The heart of Jesus' message is that he is revealing the love of God, the mercy of God, the grace of God to a people who have felt distant from God. I can't help but think of Paul's letter to the Philippians at this point, where in the 2nd chapter he makes the bold statement that Jesus came and emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant so that he would go to the cross and die for every single one of us. That doesn't sound like an unmerciful Savior to me. But the more I read this parable and study it, the less I'm likely to think that it's about a bridegroom who arrives late, or about wise or foolish maidens. I begin to think it's more about oil. Maybe the whole point of the parable is to have us think about, what is oil to us? Some years ago, I attended a preaching conference where a professor from Columbia Theological Seminary, Anna Carter Florence, spoke about this particular parable, and I wrote down in my notes the things that she said, and she wondered out loud, what kind of oil do we have in our lives that keeps us going? She recognized that the oil that Jesus is speaking of probably isn't a commodity that we can buy or sell, but simply the question of what is the fuel that is inside of us that allows us to maintain a sense of God's presence, a sense of God's grace. What does that oil look like? A couple of years ago, a woman came to our front office during the week. Her car was parked out front, the hood was up. She came in to use the phone to call the AAA tow truck. And as she waited, we were talking. She said, I can't figure out what's wrong with my car. She said, I just put gas in it and it just died. Well, when the tow truck operator came and looked into the car, sure enough, the gas tank was full. But he said to the woman, there is no oil in the crankcase. And then he asked her, didn't you notice that red light on your dashboard? And she said, I had no idea what that was about. Far be it from me to call that woman a moron. That kind of seems to be the slant of this parable. And before you chastise me for being judgmental, let me just simply say this. We have all been spiritual morons at one time or another, and maybe even right now. Just as a lamp with no oil will go out, or a car with no oil will eventually die, so also a Christian with no spiritual oil will be in danger. So when your lamp of faith, your engine of faithfulness runs out of oil, you don't have anything left to go on. What fills you up spiritually? What replenishes the sense of God's presence in your life? Where do you find God and experience God in a way to give you that encouragement for yet another day? Nobody can do this for you. You are on your own to answer that question. It's a job that rests on your shoulders. Remember the safety advice that you get whenever you go in an airplane someplace? They'll say something like, in the event of an emergency, oxygen masks will drop down from the ceiling. Please secure your own oxygen mask before you help others. We can't give what we don't have. Only when you do whatever it takes to fill your soul can you give to others in a meaningful way. Some of you have been living lately with your lights on. You know what it's like to be running out of oil. I know what it's like to be running out of oil. As a pastor, a father, a husband, a friend, I know what it's like to run to the places in life when there is nothing more to draw upon. I bet you do too. You come home from work after a busy day, and it's 105 degrees outside, and you are exhausted. And you sit down, and simultaneously, at the very same time, the cat throws up on the carpet. And the game of the week has been preempted for a presidential debate. And you go ballistic. You turn into somebody that you are not proud of, and you say words that your mother said you should never say out loud. And your spouse calmly says, let me guess, you're out of oil, right? It's fairly simple. When house plants don't get watered, they wither. When 2-year-olds don't take a nap, there will be tears. When conversations between spouses speak of only who is taking out the trash and who is picking up the kids, marriages run dry. When you've logged 70 hours a week for months on end, relationships begin to suffer. There are some fuels that are non-negotiable. If you eat junk food for 20 years, your body's going to let you know about it. You need spiritual oil in you. And you can't borrow this from anyone else. teenagers at some point come to that realization. They recognize that they can borrow the answers to a test, but they cannot borrow the hours that another person has put in to prepare for that test. You cannot borrow peace of mind from someone else. You cannot say to a friend, "You have a wonderful marriage, can I have some of that?" There are simply some things that you can only do for yourself in order to be fed and to be filled up. Why? Because you need to. There is moments every single day that calls upon this need to be spiritually full. But I know how it goes. The hours get late, we get lazy, and we doze off. And we might say to ourselves, one of these days, I'm going to get close to God. One of these days, I'm going to discover what it is that God wants for my life. One of these days, I'm going to learn how to pray. One of these days, I'm going to read the Bible. One of these days, I'm going to get into a Bible study or a small group. One of these days, I'm going to learn how it is to give of myself rather than be a taker. One of these days. One of these days. Well, the hard part about this parable as I read it is to be reminded that now is that day. Now is that time that we draw upon God's presence, that we receive this spiritual oil, and we begin to replenish our lives in a way of being able to store up more for the days to come. It's not going to come from our pension savings. It's not going to come from our good intentions or our long-range plans. It's going to come from being fed and filled now. It's going to come from wherever you see God and experience God this moment. Where else besides worship might that be? Well, later on in Matthew 25, Jesus said this: I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you comforted me. Maybe that's where we find Jesus. Maybe that's where we get filled up. When we engage in places where we are able to give what God has given us for the benefit and the sake of others, and we draw upon the fruit of the Spirit in such a way that God's love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control all become evident. It's there for the taking. I think of those church folk who use this parable as a way to scare you into heaven. You don't fill your lamp because you're afraid of getting locked out of the kingdom of heaven. And you don't stockpile oil just so that you can turn others away. No. You stop and you need to do whatever you need to do right now to replenish and reconnect with God. And to do those things where God is leading you so that oil can be placed back inside of you. What are you waiting for? Life is too short to run on empty. You owe it to yourself, to your family, to your friends, to your church, to be at full capacity, because there's a party happening out there, and you just might be the life of it. Amen. The peace of the Lord be with you always. I invite you to rise and share the peace of Christ with those who are near.